till engelska till vår gäst. Welcome up on stage. Christina Gravert, you're a professor of economics right now in Denmark, but you have been in Sweden, so you understand a bit of Swedish, but you will have your presentation in English. So welcome up on stage.
She makes it easy now. I don't know where, I don't know how. She makes it easy now.
Wow, what an audience. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. So today I'm going to talk about my research subject, so something that I've been doing research on and consulting for almost 10 years now, and something that I care a lot about and that I really hope is going to be useful to you also in your daily work. So we're going to be talking about nudging. As I was already introduced, I'm a professor at University of Copenhagen. I have a PhD in economics, and I was doing a lot of research on the subject. But then I felt it's so sad that actually this research doesn't get out to those people who can actually apply it, who can use it in their everyday life. And that's how I decided to also start a consultancy and a speaking business on the side to bring this knowledge to people who hopefully will be able to use it in their daily work. So this morning, before you came here, some of you have maybe passed by an espresso house or a Joe and a Juice, and maybe you were presented with such a selection here. 3 different sized coffee cups. Which one do you think is the most popular coffee cup? The middle one, right? We're in Sweden, lagom is best, right? So, of course, but even if we're not in Sweden, people are drawn to that middle cup. And then in an experiment that they did, they asked people and they said, well, so you chose the middle cup. Why did you choose that? And because we all believe that we're rational people, all these people said, yeah, well, the small cup didn't have enough coffee and the big cup had too much coffee, but the middle cup, that had the right amount of coffee. That's how much coffee I wanted this morning. I said, okay, I mean, we're rational human beings, so you can choose the right amount of coffee. But then they decided to change the selection a bit. And now they had this for offer. What do you think is the most popular size? The middle one, right? And again, they asked people, and I said, so you chose the middle one, why did you choose that one? And I said, well, the small one was a bit too little coffee, and the large one was a bit too much coffee, but the medium one had just the right amount of coffee. So even though we like to think that we're so rational, we are so easily influenced by how choices are presented. And not just by how choices are presented. Every decision we make every single day, and some people say we make around 35,000 decisions every day, are influenced by different cognitive biases, by different ways of thinking that get us a little bit off track from what we would assume a perfectly rational person would be. We're a little bit overconfident, we're a little bit afraid of losses, we're sometimes lack a little bit self-control to get going, and we're also influenced by what other people are doing. So let's have a look at a couple of these examples. One of these things is called cognitive load. And here the idea is if we have too many choices, we become paralyzed and we rather choose nothing than making a particular choice. If anybody ever tried to buy black pants or jeans in a store, you maybe know what I'm talking about. But it can also be relevant when we talk about things like pension plans. And I mean, here in Sweden, we're quite lucky that if we don't choose anything, we're just going to get a tjänstepension anyway. But if you're in the US, you're not that lucky. So in the US, if you don't make a choice, then you don't have any pension savings. So here they actually compared different companies, and they looked at how many choices, how many funds were available for people to choose from. And what you can see from this downward trend is that the more choices that were available, the less people actually opted into any type of pension fund. So you would think that it's a good idea to have many different funds available so everybody can pick the one that's best for them. But what actually happens is that it becomes overwhelming, and then people don't choose at all. And I'm saying we're lucky here in Sweden because, well, there's a couple of different ones to choose from here. I don't know, can somebody raise their hand who went through all 900 potential funds before choosing? No? No, and you guys, you're the ones who should be, right? You are capable of doing it. So, I mean, if this audience doesn't do it, then who does? I mean, I also didn't do it, and I have a PhD in this subject, so I also stuck with the standard one. A different thing is we're influenced by social norms. We're influenced by how people around us behave, even if we think we're so independent and we're so good at making our own decisions. Here there was a study where they gave flyers to party to different students. In one case, in a very clean environment with no trash around. In a different case, there was already a lot of trash lying around. And you might think, well, I'm not going to throw trash on the ground just because there's already trash there. But then you're in the minority. So actually we see that there's far more people who also throw their trash on the ground if other people had already done so, even though they wouldn't have done it in an otherwise clean environment. I just did a study for Naturvårdsverket here, and there we also look into this in more detail. And we actually find that people are very much influenced by what other people around them are doing. I think for Stockholm, maybe we should have chosen Slussen as an example here. But here I have an example about overconfidence. And this comes actually from the New York subway system. So in 1968, they decided to build an addition to the New York subway. The first 4 stations were opened in January 2017. And they're still not done. And this shows how with so many, especially these larger infrastructure projects, but even our own smaller projects, if you think about it, even though we probably know that last time we didn't manage to submit the report on time, but when asked, how is it going to be the next time, can you have it ready, we're quite overconfident and we think that we're going to be ready much faster than we actually should rationally believe that we will be. I don't know, probably never happens to you, only happens to me, but to me it definitely happens that I misplan here, even though I have made the same mistake before. Maybe we're also biased in ways where we think we're going to be very fair and rational. When it comes to hiring decisions, most of us will probably believe that we're not discriminating, that we can judge a person just on their merit and not on their cultural background. But when they did these studies in the UK, US, Australia, Canada, and also in Sweden, they showed that somebody who has a Muslim-sounding name has to send 50% more applications to get the same number of callbacks. And in order to measure this, they actually had the exact same CV for different people, and all they did is change the names from Eric, Carl, and Lars to Ali, Reza, and Mohammed. And these people were identical in all other respects except for their first name, and they had to send 50% more applications in order to be called back. So if we take away the names, then we see that we have a hard time not being biased here, not paying attention to it. So maybe one thing that we should do is even not read the name in the first place, even though these are big companies that tell themselves that they're not discriminating. So what do all these biases lead to? It's something what we call the intention to action gap. When we work with nudging, we're looking for situations where we have an intention-action gap, similar to, I want to hire the person who has the best qualifications, but somehow I get distracted. I want to do the right thing, I want to get up early in the morning and go running before I go to work, but somehow the bed is really comfy and maybe I'll do it tomorrow. So these are situations where people have the right intentions, the right information, and the right access to technology, or to money, or to time. So they're physically able to carry out an action. If you ask them if they want to do the action, they will also say, yes, I was planning to do that. And they also already have the correct information available, or they could look it up in a reasonable place. And yet we don't observe the behavior that we want to see. I have a friend, she works at a language learning app, and she says, well, there's so many people who sign up for this app, who pay the monthly fee, but who never do a single lecture in learning the language, actually. So these are very typical intention to action gaps. And that's really where nudging can be interesting. Because otherwise, most of us, if we don't overcome this intention-action gap, this is more likely going to be us than the person that we are envisioning ourselves to be. So why does this happen? Where does this intention-to-action gap come from? One model to think about is that we can think about that we have these two ways of thinking in ourselves. This is the system 2 thinking, which is slow and deliberate, like this Mr. Spock here, not swayed by emotion, making a plan and carrying it out. This is how we think we make decisions. And then there's the system 1 thinking. This is more Homer Simpson, which is fast and automatic, easy, emotional, and on a subconscious level. And our Homer Simpson in us, he's the one who's guided by these biases and kind of goes off the wrong path. Would it be good if Mr. Spock would take all our decisions? Probably not, because then you would never leave the house in the morning because you were still thinking about coffee and tea and blue pants versus black pants. Right? So we need this Homer Simpson to make fast decisions, but Homer Simpson can also get distracted. When we use traditional policy instruments to influence behavior, we often use regulations and laws, monetary incentives such as taxes and subsidies, and factual information. But these things only work when we're trying to target Mr. Spock, because making something more expensive is only going to work if I make a cost-benefit analysis of, okay, donuts are now more expensive, so maybe I should eat less of them. Or they have a high sugar content, maybe I should eat less of them, that's healthier for me. But it's really hard work to overcome our biases, and sometimes it is even impossible. A lot of these implicit biases, such as in hiring decisions, are very difficult to overcome, even if we really aim to. So we need to create something that we call choice architecture, the way we design choices to help individuals overcome these challenges. And that is what nudging is, redesigning the decision-making context in order to change behavior, but without restricting choice and without making things more or less expensive. So what categories of nudges are there? We're divided them into 4 categories: reframe, encourage, facilitate, and incentivize. And I'm just going to show you some different examples for each of these, because there's different ways of how we can try to overcome the biases, either by presenting information in a different way, or maybe by giving some motivating information, or maybe just making it easy. This is, for example, a pension saving example that Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize last year in economics, that he came up with. So here the idea is that people want to save money, but not right now. So maybe later. And that means that they don't save enough. So the clever idea of overcoming present bias, which is the bias that's at stake here, was to tell people, okay, you don't need to save now, but next time you get a raise, how about you put a little bit of that raise towards your pension savings, which is called Save More Tomorrow. So people opted in, and this increased savings from 3.5% to about 11%. Because it wasn't about losing money now that you need to save, but it was that future money that you hadn't yet received, which you could then put towards your savings. A different example might be, maybe we should order applicants randomly, because we can also show that if you're the first in line in any type of selection mechanism, you're going to get higher points than the person coming after you, because there's nobody to compare you to. There's no smaller cup that you're being compared to. So you automatically get higher points. So if you always order your applicants by alphabet, the person with the A as a last name, the Anderson, he's always going to be the first one in the ranking, or at least get a little bit higher points than the other ones. And the person who comes right after a star is going to receive lower points, because that person is going to look like the tinier cup in comparison to that other bigger cup. So that might be something we can do, where we actually reordering applicants makes it more fair so that they get judged in the same way and our biases don't play a role. We might also want to think about sending reminders at the right time. This was a study done in the US, and here people had to show up for court if they had some kind of misdemeanor in driving. So if you got a driving ticket, sometimes you actually then needed to show up at court. But people didn't perceive this as a big deal. They're like, well, I drove a bit too fast or I parked in the wrong place. But the problem was when people didn't show up for court, then it actually turned into a crime, and then it had very long-term consequences. But when they looked at the letter, what the government was sending out, that you actually had to show up for court, it was so difficult to read that people couldn't figure out, am I supposed to come, when I'm supposed to come, what am I supposed to do there, what are the consequences if I don't show up? So one thing they did was just simplify this letter by making it clear that you're supposed to appear in court, when you're supposed to appear, and what's going to happen if you don't. And then they sent people text message reminders a week before the court date, 3 days before the court date, and the day before the court date, so that they would actually show up. And what that led to was that almost 40% less people did not show up for court when they were supposed to, which of course saves a lot of money for the government, but also makes these people better off who didn't take this serious enough because they didn't understand the letter. So sometimes nudging can also really just be simplifying things or encouraging people here by sending reminders at the right point of time, not sending information 3 weeks in advance and then saying, well, we told them so why aren't they showing up? But because there's so many other things that are going on in our lives, these small misdemeanors, they didn't seem important to the people that had to show up. And this way, it is to remind them about that. Another tax example we have here from State. This is a study done by the Behavioral Insights team in the UK, and here they were interested in trying to see whether they could use social norms to get people to pay their taxes on time. Here they had a sample of taxpayers who hadn't paid by the deadline. So it was around May, when you knew how much you were supposed to be paying, and then you hadn't paid. And then all they did is that in the reminder letters, they had one group received the normal letter, but then different groups received an additional message which said, 9 out of 10 people in the UK, in your region, and then they said which region, or in your municipality, pay their taxes on time. You're currently in a small minority which hasn't yet paid. And those two sentences alone had about a 20% increase in people who then paid compared to the control group, which did not have that social norm message. So here we're using, similar as in the trash example, using it in a positive way and saying, well, most people do pay their taxes on time, and you haven't yet done so. This is a study from Denmark. Again, it's about simplifying forms. For the same type of form, having the exact same information, in one case it's about, or in both cases it's about your childcare costs that you had to pay and people hadn't yet paid it. But again, in the first form, people had a hard time understanding what they were actually supposed to do with this, so not a lot of people were paying even after the reminder. Redesigning this form to make it very clear how much you have to pay, that you are supposed to be paying, and how to pay, led to a 10 percentage point increase in people who then actually paid their bills. So we might think, but the information was there. I mean, if people read the letter, then they should have just paid. Why does it make such a difference? And in this case, it's green and it's written in bigger letters. You might say maybe this is just immigrants who don't understand, in this case Danish, but it's not. It's the same effect for native Danes who can actually read all of this, even if it's more governmental jargon. So we see that there can be quite a large differences in just the way that we design things and just make it easy for people to do the right thing. One more example I have from the way of how you can use nudging to change behavior is to think about when we do use monetary incentives such as taxes or subsidies, are we using them in the right way? This is again a study from the Behavioral Insights team, and I find this quite fascinating. So they were giving out very high subsidies for people to insulate the roofs. If you've ever been in the UK, then you probably know that they're not the best at insulation. So it made sense that they would pay people a lot to insulate the roofs, and also you would have very high energy savings if you did do it. But people weren't taking up the subsidy. They just weren't reacting to the subsidy. They weren't insulating the roofs. So they called in this behavioral insights team, and they asked, so what else can we do? And said, instead of sending the subsidy, let's send people flyers for home cleaning services. So they did that. And far more people were then willing to pay the full amount to get their houses insulated, just because they thought the worst thing in the world was spending Saturday and Sunday up in the attic trying to go all through the old suitcases, old clothes, bringing things to charity shops and getting rid of that. So the barrier wasn't that it was too expensive for them or that they didn't think it was a good idea, but the barrier here was that, well, honestly, they just didn't think of it. Because even before that, they could have hired somebody to clean up their attics, but only when they got these flyers, like, that's actually a good idea, and there was a number written there, you have to call them, they're available this weekend, suddenly far more people were willing to take it up. So again, it's about reducing these small barriers where we, in a rational way, where the Mr. Spock in us, the rational person, wouldn't even be distracted by. But the Homer Simpson in us, the little bit lazy, distracted person, well, they get a lot of help from these things that we call nudges. So how do we find the right nudge? So if we think that's a good idea, what's the process? So where do we start? Do we just pick something from, say, okay, slide 4 here was nice, I'm just going to implement that now, right? 9 out of 10 people do something, and then we're going to have a great result, 20% increase in payment? Probably not. So it takes a bit of time to work through this, but it's not impossible, and it's not even that difficult. So when I work with this, both in an academic context, but also in a practical consulting context, working with people such as the Swedish Unemployment Agency, Naturvårdsverket, the Health Agency, then we use this boost approach. And here it's very important that we think about what behavior is it that we're actually trying to change. Often when we try to think about using incentives or using also these nudges, people will have very high-level goals. They will say, oh, we need to make people more efficient, or we need them to care about the environment, or we need them to prioritize something more. Like, yeah, but that's not nudgeable, because that's not a behavior. And when it comes to nudging, it is a behavior change. So we need to define what the behavior actually is that we want to change. And then the second phase, and I think this is also something, even if you're not going to be doing any type of nudging, but to take with you in your daily work, is to think about what are really the barriers. So in many of my workshops, I realize that people can maybe define the behavior, but then immediately jump to conclusions and say, oh, we need to do this, and we need to send them a letter, and we need to, I don't know, send this on the website. But if we don't understand what these barriers are, what these cognitive bias, what is keeping people from carrying out that behavior, we're just going to be stabbing in the dark, similar to the behavioral or the British government with their subsidies, increasing the subsidies. But it wasn't the money wasn't the problem. It was that they didn't want to clean up their attic. So the second phase would then be like really trying to understand, putting yourself in those people's shoes. Why aren't they doing what I think would be so easy to do? Why do we have this intention-action gap? And then we can think about designing nudges, designing interventions, and there we can use a lot of different insights that has already been generated in research. And then the next part is then we study. So a lot of these effects that I showed you, they come from these type of experiments. And I know that it still maybe sounds a little bit scary to begin with, but it's really a good way to understand, did what I do actually change behavior? Or do I just want to believe, because, right, we're all biased and we're all overconfident in how good we are. So if I design that great nudge and I just implement it, and then behavior changes, and then I assume it must be because I did this amazing nudge. But maybe just the weather was better. We're working with a traffic agency here in Sweden, and the idea was we're going to nudge people in wintertime and measure how much they take the bike, and we'll measure again 6 months later. Not surprisingly, more people took the bike in June than they did in January. Probably not because of our nudge. So that's really a way of thinking. But if we have 50% of the people who receive the nudge and 50% of people who don't, and then we measure in January and in June, then we can be sure that the difference actually comes from our nudge, comes from our intervention, and not because time went by or other things happened. And then once we have these study results, once we know our effect size, then we can think about, does it make sense to roll out? Should this be in the whole of Sweden? Or maybe it wasn't such a great idea to begin with. Maybe we need to go back and think about the process again. So this is Richard Thaler, who I already mentioned, won the Nobel Prize last year. And Dick says, nudging is not the only solution to any problem, but it's part of the solution to every problem. So we're trying to say we don't want to replace other type of policy instruments. We still need laws and regulations, economic incentives, and factual information. But nudging can provide a good complement to these traditional policy tools under circumstances where they're maybe not as efficient because our Homer Simpson is in the way. If you found this interesting, and then we have a guide on our website, which you can actually download for free. You can look at it. It summarizes a lot of the things that I said today, a little bit more in detail, different types of biases. We also created an online course to learn how to do the boost model. You're welcome to check that out. And of course, I would be happy if you have any questions after this talk. I'm going to be around for a little bit longer. Maybe we have 2 or 3 minutes now to ask some questions. But otherwise, feel free to send me an email. And I hope I can answer all of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina. Extremely interesting. I think we have time for one question, and there is one question from the audience. So can the use of nudging be ethical and transparent enough for the Swedish public administration? And if so, are there any good examples that you can give us?
Yes. So I think sometimes also even in these titles, when we're thinking about påverkan or something, it sounds a little bit like manipulation or trying to get people to do things that they don't want to do. But that's definitely not the case. So there are ways to do that, and those we would call sludge instead of a nudge. So if you're trying to get people to do things they don't want. But I think if you take it in mind that it's about closing this intention-action gap, and you can actually tell people, in the case of this pension plan, they didn't secretly try to trick people into pension savings. Sometimes they're also being automatically enrolled into pension savings, for example, and you might say, well, we want to help you, we want to make it easy, or simplifying forms, for example. I think that's also a very ethical way. There could be few people who say, oh, you tricked me into, well, I mean, I guess you want to pay the bill because they're going to come after you at some point. So I think there's quite a lot of situations where it's actually you can be very open and it's still going to work the same way because it works with our biases and we're a little bit lazy.
Okay, thank you very much, Christina Gravert. Nu ska vi avsluta den här dagen. Hej då till alla er som måste springa och hämta barn.